Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Lori Roberts, and today we have quite the interesting show. If you've been following our timeline, you know that we're starting at the very beginning of Indiana, and we're following from the time of the French and Indian War, and we're going to work our way through past the Civil War this year. Today we're going to focus on an area of time between 1806 and 1812. Last week's show we had Jeremy Turner, who gave us some information on Tecumseh. And today we're going to talk again about Tecumseh and his brother the prophet and William Henry Harrison. So we're going to visit some old friends and bring them back into today's story. So today we're going to be looking at a comet, a curse, a prophet, and prophecies, and an earthquake. And that'll be who we'll be speaking to today. Someone who's going to give us some knowledge and some insight to the New Madrid earthquake and how that tied into a prophecy from Tecumseh and also his brother. So let's go back and let's do a little bit on our timeline. We all remember that William Henry Harrison was our governor of the Indiana Territory. And while he was governor, he spoke often to the Native Americans, and he dealt with Tecumseh and his brother the prophet. And one of the things that William Henry Harrison was concerned about were a lot of the Native Americans in the area were becoming very interested in what the prophet had to say. And he was beginning to worry that maybe the Indians in the area were going to be following his lead and maybe would attack more of the settlements. And he needed a way to make the prophet look less important in the eyes of the Native Americans. So he sends a message up to Prophetstown, and he tells the Indians that if he is really a prophet, ask him to cause the sun to stand still, the moon to alter its course, the rivers to cease to flow, or the dead to rise from their graves. If he can do these things, you may believe he was sent by God. Now, the prophet, we know that he also had been given the gift of prophecy, so that we are told, and some of the things that he talked about had come to pass. Now, he told the people that there would be an eclipse, but he didn't call it an eclipse. He said that he would cause the sun to darken and that the Indian nations would be able to witness it for themselves, and they could come and they could see this. Now, this was in 1806 when he made this prophecy, and it was known as the Black Sun prophecy. And he even told the date when it would be, and he said it'll be June 16th of 1811, and he told people they could come and witness this. Now, when this happened, when this eclipse happened, a lot of people started looking to the prophet for more insight. What else could he tell them that was going to happen? There was also in this same year, I mean, this was kind of one of those years where it seemed like everything was happening. If it could be, it was going to happen. And there was a comet that also appeared in the sky in 1811. And this comet was visible to the naked eye. It would have been bigger than the Hale-Bopp comet that we're used to seeing some years back. This comet was so large that it streaked through the sky, and it was visible in Europe. It was visible here in what is now the United States. And they called it in Europe Napoleon's comet because that was about the time he was going to be on an invasion, and so they saw it as well. And here it's kind of been called Tecumseh's comet because of the time period. The only other time a comet this size supposedly had been witnessed was back in the days of the Egyptian pharaohs. And so we're talking Ramesses II would have seen this comet. So this comet is kind of the precursor to what we're going to be talking about today, the New Madrid earthquakes. But this is also the time when Harrison goes up and attacks Prophetstown. Now, while he's attacking, Tecumseh has already left, and he has gone to get his followers, or try to get more followers to join in with him. And as he travels south, he notices that a lot of the Native Americans don't want to join him, and he gets very frustrated. At one point, he tells them, they have white blood because they're not joining in. So he makes a prophecy, and he tells them, you don't believe that the Great Spirit sent me? You'll know when I return to my village on Tippecanoe, I will stamp my foot, and the very earth will tremble. Now, that prophecy, when it was given, some reports say that Tecumseh was very close to the New Madrid town, maybe 50 miles to the north at a Shawnee village. And so on the morning of December 16th, when that happens, when the earth shakes, word starts to travel from one Native American group to the other that Tecumseh's, prophecy has come true, that he has stamped his foot, and that the revenge of Prophetstown is going to happen. And so the epicenter, we're going to find out, is very close to where Tecumseh was supposed to be, which brings us to the point of our show where we're going to bring in our expert. I am so excited. We have Polly Sturgeon. Polly is with the Education Outreach Coordinator with Indiana Geological and Water Survey at the University in Bloomington. She oversees the survey's public services, outreach programming, social media, and exhibits, and we are tickled to death to have you. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You are welcome. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to this position, and what you brought with you that kind of goes along with today?
Sure, absolutely. I moved to Indiana in 2009 to attend graduate school. I went and got my master's in education and geology at IU, and then I got a job at the survey and just never left. So I get to talk to people about all manner of geologic things. Fossils and rocks and earthquakes is a big part of my job, so I'm happy to talk about a little bit of our geologic past here with you today.
Well, I am so excited. When you said fossils, it was like my radar went up. Because I said, oh, another show. So what do you have with you that kind of pertains to your job? It looks like it's kind of interesting. Did you write something that you brought with you, and maybe the viewers could see what you have?
Yes, absolutely. So we just came out with a new book about a month ago called Indiana Rocks. It's a geologic guide to interesting places in the Hoosier State.
It's really nice.
Yes, and it details 50 places that you can go see, publicly accessible places to go learn about different rocks and fossils that you can find in the state, but also some areas with earthquakes. And number 10 in that book is the Prophetstown battlefield, because it is related to the New Madrid earthquakes from 1811 and 1812.
Okay, so kind of give us an idea. Prophetstown, this part of the country would have been not as populated as what we would have thought, the number of people who lived in the area. So probably the number of people who could give us an account are slim to none, because, it was a smaller, but a big occurrence, but a small group of people. What can you tell us, first of all, what can you tell us about this earthquake? What would it have been like here? And then maybe you can lead us into what happened, scientifically what happened.
Well, you're right in that there weren't too many people living here in 1811 and 1812. We were a fairly new territory here in Indiana. We hadn't achieved statehood yet. But Indiana, the pioneers who were living here certainly would have felt the earthquakes that happened closer down to Memphis, Tennessee, in what we call the New Madrid earthquake series. They began in December of 1811. There was this magnitude 7.5 earthquake in northeastern Arkansas. It was felt as far away as Washington, D.C. and New York City, and even down to Charleston, South Carolina. That first earthquake happened to shoot water and sand out of the ground. It's something called liquefaction, where you have large earthquakes, and anywhere where you have wet, sandy soil, it can actually shoot up into the air. And so people would have thought it was the end of the world. They didn't know what was going on. And that wasn't the only one that was going to occur. The next large primary earthquake happened just a few months later, about a month later, in January 23rd of 1812.
Okay.
So just a couple of weeks later, it was a magnitude 7.3. And when I say magnitude, that's on a scale from 0 to 10. That one was nearby, or just across the border in New Madrid, Missouri. That one was slightly smaller, so it wasn't felt quite as widespread, but it still caused some significant damage for any of structures that did remain in this area at that time. Then again, about a month later, on February 7th of 1812, there was another 7.5 magnitude earthquake, also in New Madrid, and that was the final one in the series of 3 primary earthquakes. That one was said to be the most severe. It knocked down buildings in St. Louis and Cincinnati and in Kentucky, and while historical records don't necessarily point out just Indiana, the proximity of Indiana and Indianapolis, and even here in Bedford, to those cities would indicate that we would have had the same effects. The historical accounts are what we base those magnitude scales off of. There were actually no seismographs, no recording devices in North America in 1811 and 1812. So we've based our reports off of historical records, eyewitness reports that were in the newspaper, things like that. But the damage and the descriptions that we get from those are pretty substantial. It was said to have the Mississippi River running backwards from the waves that were crashing down.
Yeah.
There were large ruptures in the ground that opened up. The ground moved up and down pretty rapidly. The earthquakes lasted anywhere from a minute to 3 minutes, some of them did. And then what I think is the craziest part, so that not only were there 3 magnitude 7.5 roughly earthquakes in 3 months, but then in that 3 months time period, there were over 2,000 aftershocks. Some of them even getting up as high as into the 7.0 range. I would have thought it was the end of the world too.
Well, and that's one of the things I was reading, getting ready for this program. Some of the accounts, there was a minister from near New Madrid, and he talked about all the saints and sinners who wanted to make sure that they were right with God because they were so afraid that, it really was the end of the world.
Yeah.
And was it true from what you've researched where there were people and livestock who they never accounted for because once the ground opened up, some of these people fell in. I mean, truly, they didn't know what happened to them. Is that true?
From what I've seen, there's actually been only one recorded death attributed to the New Madrid earthquakes, and that was a man who was killed inside of a falling building in the town of New Madrid.
Okay.
But people who are living out in more rural communities, especially out here in the Indiana Territory, there might not have been as good of news coverage, so it's hard to say for certain.
And it was interesting, too. One of the accounts that I was looking at had to do with Nicholas Roosevelt, and he was assigned to pilot this new steamboat called the New Orleans, and Robert Fulton had built it, and he and his wife Lydia were supposed to bring it from Pittsburgh to New Orleans. And when they got to Louisville, they stopped because they had to ford the falls of the Ohio, and she gave birth to a son while she was there. She was pregnant. They were there when the earthquake, actually, they had made it down the falls. Do you have any record of Lydia and his journey?
I've heard a little bit about that story, but I think you told me a few new details that I hadn't heard before, so that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and they made it all the way down. They talked about how the banks, as the earthquake was happening, they were mostly just trying to make sure that they didn't get, the logs and stuff didn't get caught in the paddle wheel, which was really amazing to think that they were able to make it all the way down the river, the Mississippi, after they, got to the Ohio and the Mississippi. But they talked about how they would just see the banks just collapse. And then the waves would go up. And I can't imagine having a toddler, a new baby, and being on, out in the middle of nowhere and seeing that. That would just...
Yeah, the landslides on any of the slopes or steep hillsides were another really common thing. And what I think is kind of interesting is that we think about this as being sort of we're far removed from it. That was back in the early 1800s. But Indiana has actually had several large earthquakes like this in prehistoric times. We can tell from geologic evidence between about 12,000 years ago to about 4,500 years ago, there were several large earthquakes to cause that liquefaction scenario where sand and water shoots out of the ground.
Yeah.
And you have to have a pretty big earthquake to do that. And we can see evidence of it throughout Indiana and then also farther south towards the New Madrid. Here in the central United States, including Indiana, we're number 3 for earthquake risk in the U.S.
Wow, number 3?
Number 3.
Oh, wow.
Everybody
Okay.
thinks about California and
Yeah.
Alaska, and those are numbers 1 and 2, but Indiana and the rest of the central U.S. is number 3. And that's really because of our geology. The New Madrid earthquakes and all of the earthquakes modern times that we've had here in the state are because of our fault lines. North America tried to sort of pull itself apart or rift apart about 500 million years ago, and it caused 2 big fault areas. That's what that map is there.
Okay.
The New Madrid fault zone, which everybody has kind of heard of, but then we also have the Wabash Valley seismic zone that touches up into Indiana.
Okay.
We're not sure if they're related or connected. We're still trying to figure that part out as scientists. But we've got 2 fault zones that are active and constantly accumulating some stress, and they are producing earthquakes all the time.
When this earthquake happened, of course, a lot of people, like you said, it was just aftershock and then these huge, I mean, I can't even wrap my head around a 7.7. I went through that 5.4 or 3 that we had
Yeah.
here in about 2009, and that scared the stuffings out of me,
Yeah.
just going through that. But not only was that going on, but you kind of touched on some of the other things. What would people have, I'm a very sensory person, so things in my memory would stick to me with like smells, sounds, taste. I can remember things very easy. What would they have smelled and what would they have heard? What were some of the things that went with that horrible earthquake?
Yeah, once you start getting into magnitude 6s and 7s, you start getting really severe shaking. And so when you have earthquakes of that magnitude, you can actually hear the energy moving through the ground. A lot of people say it sounds like a freight train coming up towards you and then moving past you. They would be hearing trees cracking and all of that sediment giving way along the riverbanks to cause those landslides, like you mentioned with the paddle boat. They would be hearing trees cracking, and for those few people who did live in, the primitive structures out here in the territories, chimneys crumbling, and structures starting to give way a little bit. The William Henry Harrison home, Grouseland, up in Vincennes, has a crack on the second-story floor. From the New Madrid earthquake series. I don't know which one in the 3 primary earthquakes it caused, or maybe it was all of them. But they would have been I would have been afraid if I had been there.
Well, we had took a tour of the home a couple shows ago, and that was one of the rooms, and I can't remember if we showed that on the tour or not. If not, that's a good reason to go back to Grouseland if you've never been and find that room that has the crack. In fact, I think there's one on each corner. I think the Vigo room and then that soldier's room both had, I think.
The soldier's room is the one I'm thinking of.
Yes, the one that if you're down the hall, it's on the left side. But can you imagine being in a home, and this house was built like a fortress anyway, we found out, but can you imagine being in the only brick home probably around, and people would have been afraid and probably tried to get there for safety, and to see all the destruction in that house, not having the damage to the outside, that would have been amazing.
Even though we're pretty far away from the epicenter of these earthquakes, the Midwest, our rocks are really cold and very dense, and earthquake waves can travel really far through that kind of material before they lose any energy. So it would have been fairly similar to what they were feeling even further south, up at Vincennes or anywhere else here in Indiana.
That's crazy. What were it's kind of like a tar ball, or I can't think what they called them, but they said those things came up.
Oh yeah.
What are those?
So especially around, it's what we call as geologists the Illinois Basin, but this sort of the underlying rocks that make up the central United States. There's a lot of coal and exposed in some areas of the Midwest, and so down in the southwestern Indiana, for example. And so there would be coal balls from a seam of coal that would pop up because the ground was shifting when the earthquake was happening. And so I've read accounts where they'd find it on the ground of something that should have been several feet down.
That's interesting. Now, what did an earthquake smell like? So we've got the ground opening up. What would people have, because I know a lot of people said some people died from dirty air. I mean, they literally got physically ill. What were they smelling from these earthquakes?
You would smell, I would imagine, a lot of fresh earth from things moving, or there's just sort of a smell of water sometimes. Like I wouldn't say that's the same smell that rain has, but there's a little bit of a smell there. Here, modern times, we would smell gas because gas lines often break, but of course they didn't have that back then.
Would they have smelled like sulfur or anything from the earth?
If they were near an area where there was a lot of coal or petroleum, they could have, but it wouldn't have been widespread.
Okay. All right. So now that we know the extent of the damage and how devastating it would have been to be in this earthquake, kind of bring us to the modern. What do you do as a geologist as far as what can you tell us? Because most of us have lived through earthquakes here in Indiana, and they may not have been obviously to that magnitude, but what's the outlook for us? I mean, what do you know about?
So the New Madrid earthquake is said to have a 500-year reoccurrence. And there's a lot of math and physics that goes into figuring that out. And that doesn't mean that 500 years to the date there's going to be an earthquake, because we still cannot figure out or predict earthquakes. And I don't think we'll ever be able to. It's just not the way that science works. But even if it's going to be several hundreds of years until there's, the next big one, so-called, or a magnitude 7.5, we still get about 200 earthquakes in the central United States every year. It has to be a magnitude 3 or higher for us to feel. So there's not too many of those. Indiana gets about a moderate earthquake maybe every 5 years or so. So part of what my job is I travel around the state and teach people about earthquakes and how to prepare for them. Indiana is one of 3 states that has an earthquake simulator. It's called the Quake Cottage, and we take it around to schools and museums and government centers, and we actually take it up to a magnitude 7, so it would have been like what it felt like in the New Madrid earthquake. And so I get to show people what it would have felt like, which kind of connects it to home a little bit, and then talk about the science from there.
So like if somebody wants, pardon me, to bring that to their school, or like a community, who would they get a hold of?
They would contact me, or just the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. If you just Google Indiana geology, we're usually the first thing that comes up. And we go to about 10 places a year, but we're always looking for new places to go in Indiana.
Well, I'm thinking if you want to be the cool teacher in the building, you want to get her to come
Yeah,
and bring.
it's a pretty neat device.
Yeah, I could see all the kids wanting to get in there and get shook up a little bit. So now we know that Indiana's number 3. That really, I learned that. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
What kind of things could we tell the viewers, because we are prone, and I mean, we're waiting on the big one, what should we do to be prepared?
That's a great question. There are 3 really big things that you can do to be prepared, and 2 of them are free, and 1 of them costs about $20. The first is to practice the earthquake drill. Just like in grade school, we practice the tornado drill and fire drills. A lot of schools in Indiana are starting to incorporate earthquake drills where you do what's called drop, cover, and hold on. Whenever you feel shaking, you're supposed to go under a table, a chair, something to protect your head, and hold on to it until the shaking stops, and then you go outside. So practicing that makes it easier to actually do it when the event is happening. The second thing you can do is to make a family plan. Talk to the people that you live with. Where would you meet outside after an earthquake or after a fire, anything bad that could happen? Because after the shaking stops, you always want to go outside to make sure the building is safe and to make sure everyone else comes out too. So pick a place like a mailbox or a stop sign that you would all meet as a family. The third one, make a disaster kit. Things like food, water, non-perishable food, water, first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, put it into a 5-gallon bucket or a backpack, so it's all in one place. And you can use it, of course, for a winter ice storm or a tornado, but it's also there when you need it for an earthquake too. That's the one that cost me about $20, and I keep it by the back door of my house.
And you might want to put your medications in that as well.
Yes.
So if you're on certain kinds of medicine, you might want to kind of reserve, what is it, 5 days they tell you at least?
They say between 4 and 7 days, yeah, if the power were to go out. And we've got a list of all of the things that you could put in your disaster kit on our website. It's igs.indiana.edu/earthquakes.
Okay, well, we'll try to get that at the end of the program
Yeah.
and put that in for people, so if they're wanting to have that added, that they can get that. So if you're wanting to know more about the programs that Polly is familiar with, where she works at IU Geological and Water Survey, she could line you up with those. Is there anything else we need to know about earthquakes that we didn't get to ask you that you want to make sure we know, or?
I just think it's important to know that even if you haven't felt one in several years, or sometimes, high school students, they can't really remember feeling one. They were pretty little when the last moderate earthquake happened. Know that we still are in a seismically active area, and the New Madrid earthquakes are a good reminder of that. And of course, there's a lot of interesting history that goes along with it, but it's all based on our science.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
To have you. Well, this brings us to the curse portion of the program, and this has been documented in Ripley's Believe It or Not, and it's on the burning of Prophetstown, and it goes back to William Henry Harrison. And when William Henry Harrison burned this village of Prophetstown, some of his men also desecrated some of the graves of the Shawnee that were buried there. And this is probably one of the reasons why the Native Americans were so upset. And this is about the time when this curse was brought about, was when Harrison was wanting to become president down the road. The curse was from the prophet, if Harrison is ever elected, he will not live out his term, nor will any of the other people who follow him in an odd year. And the term odd means a year that ends in 0. So Harrison, in that first time that he runs for office, we know he ran in 1836, he didn't win, but then he ran again, and he used the log cabin campaign that we talked about in the last couple of shows, and he went even by the nickname Old Tippecanoe, and that angered a lot of the Native Americans, that he was making light of that and using that as his nickname to get elected. So this curse doesn't affect him until he becomes president, or so this Ripley's Believe It or Not account says. Now, he does become president in 1840, and we know from past shows that he does fall ill, and by 1841 he's only lived so many, I think 30 some days, and then he passes away. Those people who had heard the curse, they were keeping count, and of course most people in the United States didn't know anything about the curse. So that pretty much stayed silent until the next president, who would be elected in an odd year, and that was Abraham Lincoln. And of course, we know the story of Abraham Lincoln. He lived out his first term, but it was during his second term that he was assassinated and killed in office. So he did not serve and live out his second term. 20 years later, we have James Garfield, okay? So here's Lincoln. Our next one is Garfield. Now, James A. Garfield was in his first term as president, and he was elected to the presidency and took office in 1880, but took office in 1881. And on July 2nd, Charles Guiteau shot the president, and it eventually led to his death. Now, obviously, people started to think, Wonder what's going on with these presidents that are getting elected in an odd year. The next one would be William McKinley. And William McKinley was elected in an odd year of 1900. William McKinley served into his second term, and he was assassinated. And obviously, in 1920, people are starting to add these dates up, and that would be Warren G. Harding. Now, Warren G. Harding is one of the presidents that we're not really sure. Did he suffer from an assassination attempt, or was Harding the victim of natural causes? We know that he had either a stroke or a heart attack. Either way, he did not serve out his term. The next president that we know a lot about is FDR. FDR was elected in 1940, and he served the start of his fourth term, and he died at the end of the third term before he went on. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Now, he wasn't assassinated, but again, he died in office. The next president that we probably know the most about, and here just last week celebrated, unfortunately not celebrated, but observed the anniversary of his assassination, and that's John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated, elected in 1960, assassinated in 1963. The next president is the one that's said to have broke the curse, and that was Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan, it's interesting, Ronald Reagan ran against a president who did know something about the curse. Jimmy Carter was asked about the curse, and they asked him, they said, do you feel like you want to run again? Because this is going to be a year that ends in zero in 1980. And he made the comment, I'm good with whatever. If my time is to come, then I'm good with that. Well, he didn't get elected, and Ronald Reagan did. And when Reagan was elected, he had only been in office for a very short time, and there was an assassination attempt on his life. John Hinckley shot him, and of course he was very near death. They said that that broke the curse. And so no president had been assassinated. Following Reagan, George W. Bush is elected in an odd year, in the year 2000. And we do know that there were some attempts on his life as well. There was survived 2 assassination attempts and several plots. There were other presidents who were elected in years that ended in zero, or they served during a time when they were also had assassination attempts, but they were not able to be successful. So guess what? We have an election coming up in 2020 that ends in an odd year. And so people are already starting to get their radars up and thinking, you know, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Is this curse about to be repeated, or did Reagan break the curse? So I don't know. Tecumseh and the prophet, I think, are probably watching, and they're going to keep us on our toes. I hope you've enjoyed this program as much as I have, interviewing Polly and getting to know more about the great earthquake of 1811, 1812. If you're interested in looking at some of the places that Polly talked about, you can go online, or you can email us at the Historically Speaking with Lori Roberts on our Facebook page. I'd be glad to get you the information on her book. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the program, and I'm Lori Roberts, your host, and I'll see you the next time. Thank you.